So yes, I'm Ingrid Shearer. I'm the Heritage Engagement Manager for Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. For those of you who I've not met before, I'm a recovering archaeologist, maybe would be the best way to describe it. I spent a long time working for GARD, was one of the founding members of Northlight Heritage, and I joined the trust in 2019. So I'm still a bit of a newbie within the kind of buildings and architectural world. So that there won't be an awful lot of archaeology in this talk, but I was kind of thinking today, buildings are really just material culture anyway, and architecture is really just a sub-discipline of archaeology anyway, so it is kind of an archaeology talk. And you know, if you do know any architects, you should be sure to tell them that they're just a sub-discipline of archaeology, because they like to hear things like that. So tonight's talk is going to be a fairly shameless plug for GBPT. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of kind of what we do, how we work, have a little bit of a look at some of the changes in the city and the sector over the past 40 years. I'll use the West Boathouse as a little bit of a case study, and hopefully end on kind of a positive note, and maybe have some time for a bit of discussion as well. The title for the talk, it'll be great when it's finished. That came from a film that we made for our 40th anniversary 2 years ago, and I've put a link in the chat to the film, so you can maybe watch that after. I'm really pleased with the way it turned out, actually. So it was a quote from a comedian called Craig Ferguson, and he was asked in the 1980s what he thought about the regeneration in the city. And he said, "Oh, it'll be great when it's finished." Obviously, no city is finished, but Glasgow does seem to go through these kind of periodic, kind of convulsive fits of regeneration and renewal, and that's a kind of common thread really through the talk tonight. So we are really quite a small charity. There's only 5 staff. We were founded in 1982, and we work to repair and repurpose historic buildings by converting them for viable new uses. And we work with community groups and charities, third sector, local authorities and social enterprises to help give life to old buildings. And we tend to take on the most challenging projects, so the ones that nobody else would be willing or able to tackle. And we do that through partnership work, and the ability to access charitable and public funding that would be unavailable to, say, some of the local authorities, or certainly to commercial developers. So over the past 40 years, we've raised and invested at least £40 million and completed over 30 restoration projects, in addition to supporting lots of other projects and doing lots of kind of consultancy work. The building that you can see at the top of the slide there, that's obviously Kelvin Grove Bandstand. That's 100 years old this year, and we're also celebrating 10 years since the completion of the restoration works there. So just to give you an idea of the kind of scope and scale of what we do, this is a wee map showing some of our projects over the last 40 years. So the green dots are big kind of capital works projects, and the purple dots are for our kind of consultancy work. We mostly work within Glasgow, but we have very recently branched out to Kilbarchan, and we're doing a feasibility study there on Kilbarchan Steeple, so we're just about to get kicked off with that. But you can see there's a good spread across the city. And the little box there, this is kind of a detail from that. So you can see there's a concentration in the city centre as well. I'm sure there'll be lots of buildings there that you're familiar with. And in 1990, we introduced Doors Open Days Festival to the UK. That was as part of Glasgow's term as European City of Culture. That now attracts just over 30,000 visits to over 100 participating venues. It's a completely free programme with events, walks and talks. This year's festival runs from the 16th till the 21st of September. And again, our partners at Glasgow University have very, very kindly offered us the ARC building as the festival hub. We run the festival on kind of a shoestring budget, and we rely very heavily on volunteers. So we're very grateful to Glasgow University for that. And we also create and deliver a lot of kind of grassroots heritage engagement and outreach across the city. And I mean, that runs from looking at the history of the Barras and the Carlton, to the history of roller skating in the city. It's not all about buildings. We take a really practical approach to conservation and renewal, and all our work is rooted in partnership. The critical point here is about finding suitable, viable end uses for buildings and how that end use can benefit surrounding communities. So funding and support for projects often comes from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We also get funding from the Architectural Heritage Fund, Historic Environment Scotland, and then a range of kind of local and national government pots. So some funding from Glasgow City Council, the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund, and the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund. So some of these are really quite big national pots. Core funding from for our work comes mostly from what's called op to tax. So you may be aware that VAT is payable at full rate on any repairs or alterations to buildings. This is not the case with new builds. It's only on existing buildings. So as you can imagine, for historic buildings, this is a big disincentive to that kind of long-term maintenance and renewal. Because we can potentially claim that tax back, it means that we can do these projects that a commercial developer just would not touch, because it's cheaper economically for them to demolish and build new. We can tap into those funding sources. And that's the kind of business model that most of the kind of building preservation trusts are set up on. That movement kind of started in the late 20s and then grew significantly through the 70s and 80s. I think there's about maybe 300 BPTs now across the UK. This is where it all started for us back in 1982, the Brigate Fish Market. So at the time, in the early 70s, they started consolidating all the kind of wholesale markets in the city centre. So that was the fish market, the fruit market, the cheese market, and they were all moved up to this new purpose-built facility up at Blochairn. And the plan was they were going to demolish the Brigate, and there would be a multi-storey car park put in its place. They were going to retain the 1665 merchant steeple, but the rest of the building would have been gone. So it really lay derelict for a couple of years, and then it had this demolition order in 1980, and that was really what kind of galvanized this little group of people to come together to save the building. And it kind of represents a kind of high tide mark after a period of kind of really wanton demolition, really, through the 60s and 70s. It was one of the kind of first pushbacks against that. So they formed the Bridgegate Trust, which later became Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. And we celebrated our 40th anniversary a couple of years ago. Just to give you a sense of how long it can take to renew an old building, this is currently phase 3 of the Brigate project. This is being run by Wasp's Artist Studios. So they took on the space in the early 2000s. But this is 40 years after phase 1. So this is the redevelopment of the 1873 and 1889 halls. and the 1912 corner block. So that's going to be a new kind of market and art space. And I just popped this image in because it was such a beautiful day when we were up for the site visit, and I was looking over the roof lines at the 1873 hall, and I'm just thinking I was really glad that I didn't have to deal with it because it's so complicated. So a couple of years ago, I went to see Eric Watt's exhibition at the Kelvin Grove, and I think, like a lot of people, I was really drawn to this image. It seemed to really kind of encapsulate that particular period of time in the 1970s. You know, all these tenements being kind of pulled down, and they were mostly viewed as being, you know, overcrowded. They were cold, they were unsanitary. You know, this kind of like slum clearance of the city centre and a kind of hollowing out. And you might have noticed from that map that I showed you of our previous projects, there's lots of kind of civic buildings, there's schools and churches, and public halls, and that's partly because of our relationship with Glasgow City Council. We take on a lot of their assets, but it's also worth, I think, considering how buildings become derelict. And generally, it takes a long time, and it takes a long time to then bring them back. Heritage is becoming increasingly kind of politicized, and it's very easy to kind of point fingers, but it's worth remembering that there's no one administration is solely to blame for the state of Glasgow's buildings. There's a lot of very complicated factors at play here, and that kind of blame game and political posturing just really wastes a lot of time and energy. Overwhelmingly, buildings become derelict because they've become redundant. So either they're no longer fit for purpose, or the community that they were built for just doesn't exist anymore. And I think those kind of changing demographics is something that gets missed out of the discussions a lot. So I'm sure you're very well aware of this, of how fast Glasgow grew in the sort of mid 1800s onwards, and you have this glut of kind of big civic building projects from the sort of 1880s to World War I. So loads of schools and churches and borough halls and public baths that were built to serve this rapidly expanding population. And that population peaked at around about 1.2 million. And then went off a cliff after the Second World War. So we've essentially lost about half our population in the space of about 60 years, and that had a huge impact. So lots of areas that were once very densely populated, and particularly around the kind of city centre and the East End, were cleared in the 1960s. You have this massive displacement of communities following the Second World War. And some of that's down to local authority boundary changes, and I'll come back to that later on. But that kind of hollowing out and removing young families and skilled workers out to the new towns and stuff, that has had a huge impact on the city. And there's also those kind of wider societal changes. So I'm sure you're very well aware that the Church of Scotland has begun selling off an awful lot of their churches. Obviously, you have declining congregations and that kind of post-war increasing secularization, but you could potentially argue that we maybe had a bit of a surfeit of churches anyway. There was a lot of schisming for a while in the church in the sort of early 1800s. I guess one of the advantages with having churches in the city centre is that they don't generally come with, or they don't always come with graveyards, which makes them easier to repurpose. But this is going to be a serious challenge, really, what to do with all these old buildings. Some buildings, of course, become redundant because, you know, a result of kind of changing technologies. You think about the police boxes, for instance, or public baths. So for a lot of new swimming pools built, and there's that kind of trend towards kind of consolidation of sports services. And then, of course, the kind of affordability of domestic washing machines meant that you didn't need steamies anymore. All these things impact as well. There's also issues around about kind of poor accessibility and outmoded facilities. And, lots of buildings can be retrofitted to, accommodate platform lifts and stuff. But certainly the Victorians did not design particularly people-friendly, welcoming spaces. They were designed really to impress and inspire, and they weren't necessarily thinking about is this a welcoming space to come into those kind of like modern sensibilities that we have now. And I popped this slide in. This is a guy that I was at uni with actually many years ago, and I came across it the other day. This is Dr. DJ Johnston Smith. He did his PhD looking at what happened in Edinburgh in the 1960s, because there was quite a big decant from there as well. But he pieced together statistical information on closures and demolitions in Scottish cities, and you can see Glasgow really went to town on the demolition front between 1960 and 1975. Aberdeen, not so much. I'm wondering actually if it was just down to the fact that there's a lot of granite buildings, and they're probably harder to demolish. I think they maybe just thought better of it. So GBPT set up in the 1980s, the Brigade really kind of kick-started things, and then we took on more and more work. So through the 1980s, we did the Stuart Memorial Fountain in Kelvin Grove, and then stepped up a gear then in the 1990s. So Well Park, where our offices are now, the Tobacco Merchants House, lots of buildings that I'm sure you're very familiar with. St Andrews in the Square, Castle Milk Stables, and then into the 2010s, we had Kelvin Grove Bandstand, Parkhead School, the West Boathouse, which we'll come to, and a few others. We also do a lot of kind of consultancy work. So this is just a little snapshot of some of the stuff we've done over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. Every building that we work on is unique, and it needs that kind of hand-knitted approach, and they each have their own challenges. There's no kind of easy fixes or shortcuts really. So managing expectations becomes a big part of that process as well. And when we consider taking on a building, we spend as much time looking at the kind of ownership, governance, funding, and long-term sustainability as we do at the building itself. And I just popped in there. This is our first programme from 1990 for Doors Open Days. And we celebrated the 30th anniversary of that in 2019 with a nice big mural. So we have hit a few milestones recently, that 30th anniversary for Doors Open Days. And we're now in just past our 40th anniversary. And it was a really nice opportunity to kind of take stock and kind of look back at our own legacy and think about how the sector's changed over the past 40 years. And we're really fortunate in that we've got some previous directors of GBPT now sitting on our board. So Liz Davidson and Eleanor McAllister are with us, and it's been really fantastic having that kind of long-term institutional organisational memory there on tap. I suppose the other big change now in the last sort of 40 years is that we kind of talk about the built environment rather than buildings, and there's a much more kind of holistic approach. So it's all about kind of setting those individual buildings within their wider cultural and natural environments. There's much greater weight given to the kind of social value of the built environment, and while the architectural significance is still important, and that can be really helpful in securing funding, it's not really the be all and end all that it maybe once was. I think understanding and appreciating what a building or a place means and can mean to communities is really essential in bringing in that kind of funding and securing its future. And of course, over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen a shift now in terms of kind of thinking about the environmental impact of buildings. And the buildings and construction sector is still by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. I think it's around about 40% of all global emissions still. So policy-wise, there's been a big shift towards kind of retention and renewal rather than demolition. And we also run a lot of sort of outreach and engagement activities and consultation events and whatnot. So that included a project called My Historic Neighbourhood. So we were kind of celebrating 100 years of the Barras Market. It was great fun. And we got some of the traders' patter engraved on the curbs around the market. And we did a film and a project about roller skating in Glasgow, and we got to have the premiere of the film in the Barrowlands Ballroom. We also worked with schools up in Sighthill, looking at the Radical War and the Martyrs Monument. We were in Govan, and we've just finished up a textile project with the Gaelic School in the East End. So I just thought now we'd have a wee look at the West Boat House, just as a little kind of case study, sort of looking at how these kind of projects work. So this is the West Boat House. It's down on Glasgow Green, so just up from the tidal weir. It was built in 1905 for there's 2 rowing clubs, Clyde Amateur Rowing Club and Clydesdale Amateur Rowing Club. They were both founded in the mid 1800s, and yeah, the building was built in 1905 by Glasgow Corporation, category B listed, and we finished that last year. This was it in 1910, just after it opened. It's essentially a kind of arts and crafts sports pavilion that sits on the side of the river, and even though it looks like a masonry building, it's not, but I'll talk a little bit about that down the line. At the time, rowing was a really, really popular spectator sport. So in the 1860s, you would get crowds of up to kind of 30,000 plus lining the banks of the river, mostly because you could bet on races. So this image here is from the Clydesdale Amateur Rowing Club Regatta of 1865. This is the architect of the boathouse. This is Alexander Beath MacDonald. You may be familiar with him. He's responsible for pretty much every civic building in Glasgow between 1890 and 1915. So Govan Hill Baths, People's Palace, so many, White Veil Baths. And he took a really interesting approach to a really difficult site. Building on a riverbank is not the easiest of tasks, and he used these massive timber piles to kind of pin the building to the riverbank. And when I first started working on the project, I thought that was, yeah, I thought, God, why would you build a timber building in one of the rainiest cities in the world and right beside a river? But actually it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. It's a timber structure is lightweight and it's got enough flex to move with the riverbank. Very unusual in a Scottish context to have a building like this. So by the time we got it in, when did we start on site? Was that 2021, I think. It probably wouldn't have survived another winter. So the building owners, well, were and are still Glasgow City Council. The clubs now have it on a very long-term lease, and we had a £2.8 million budget, which I know sounds like a lot, but once you get into buildings, it just disappears like that. These were some of our, well, actually, it's all our funders there. So finding funding for buildings it can be tough, and it takes a long time, and you have to have everything kind of all your ducks in a row. We tend to get a lot of funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and then other funders will kind of follow suit. They tend to kind of take a lead from each other. When we took the building on, it looked like this. There was literally water pouring in through the roof. The clubs were still using the building at this stage, which is just, I mean, the conditions were horrendous. This was the men's showers. They were much better than the women's showers, which were directly below, and everything used to drip through the floor onto the poor women. But it had a lot of character, and it was very much loved by the clubs. It's on one level, it's a very utilitarian building, but it had all these lovely kind of architectural flourishes, and it's really a building that's designed to be seen from the water. It looks quite almost like an army barracks or something from the Glasgow Green side. It's much better seen from the Gorbals side. So this is the gym up in the Clydesdale half of the building. So the clubs had one half each. And then this was down in the boat bay with all their rowing boats. So we had lots of leaks. The exterior of the building was in very poor condition. The render had cracked and was falling off. The balcony supports were all rotten. The actual this was kind of while we were actually on site. We didn't take it on looking like this, but it's a great photo. This is kind of up under the eaves, and it shows you how the building's actually constructed. And it is just a big timber box. And the walls, I said that it looks like a masonry building from the outside. It's not. It's got this basically a kind of lath, a metal lath tacked onto the inside, and then just like a couple of coats of render. The walls are literally about 1.5 inches thick, or they were. And then we had tons and tons of wet rot, lots and lots. So these massive timber piles here that go down about 5 meters, of the 30 that were originally part of the building, there were only 2 left with any kind of connection between the above ground and the below ground structure. It was very, very close to just sliding off its foundations and straight into the river. And you can see there, I mean, actually the above ground structure wasn't too bad. Most of the work and most of the money went into the foundations. So when we started on site in February 2021, we put the external scaffold up, we stripped off all the render, stripped off all the roof tiles because they're very heavy, and that was to kind of lighten the load, put the tarp on the roof, put OSB board right up around the structure to give it a bit of weatherproofing and rigidity, and then started stripping out all the kind of internals for repair and reuse. And we put up this emergency scaffold here. So quite difficult working conditions. And then on top of that, we had COVID, obviously. And then actually the war in the Ukraine had a big impact on us as well. Ukraine is a big steel producing country, and we used a lot of rebar steel in the new foundations. So that kind of slowed us down a little bit as well. So we had the building kind of propped up for a while, and until we got the foundations done, we couldn't really proceed with anything else. But once we got that sorted, we could start work on the roof, and then it was all full, all systems go. Got the tiles on, started working on the walls. So we put in insulation for one thing. The building had never been insulated, and there was no heating in it. And a render system, a new render system that uses a lot of silicon, so that gives again a little bit of flex because it is a site that kind of moves a lot. We also put in new coin stones on the corners. So the original coins were not actually made of stone. They were essentially kind of like layering a cake. They were just built up with layer after layer of plaster. The new coins are very essentially very fancy, very expensive polystyrene, sort of precast, but it does the job. And again, it's nice and lightweight. And we also put a new pontoon in. So that's to help aid access to the river. It's not a fully accessible site in terms of kind of adaptive rowing, but it was as close as we could get. So we went from a building that looked like this in 2016 to this. This is how it looks now. And some nice interior shots. So we basically stripped out all the timber, all this woodwork here, all the windows, all the doors were all taken off site, dipped and stripped, repaired, and then returned and reinstated to the building. And it's really quite nice. So it's just some more shots there. This was before the clubs got back in and started creating havoc and putting boats back in there. The other thing we did was lower the floor, partly to accommodate the slope of the riverbank, but it also meant that they could get more space. And that was one of the things that I learned very quickly with the rowing community. It's like they're absolute monomaniacs. They're just into going fast backwards on water. And their top priority was how many boats that they could get in the boat shed and just being able to have a space that was usable. Some of them were really interested in the heritage, but for the most part, that is their top priority. So as part of the Boathouse project, there was a big community outreach and engagement program that ran alongside. And you might wonder, well, why should public money be spent on a project to benefit a small group of elite athletes? And rowing does have a bit of an image problem, like a lot of elite sports. So I can't really do anything about rowing's image problem. That's really up to them, and the clubs, to their credit, have done a lot of work in terms of kind of addressing the lack of diversity and trying to make it more accessible and kind of open to new members, and encouraging a more kind of welcoming and inclusive kind of culture within the building and within the clubs themselves. That was not my priority. That's for them to deal with. For me, it was really all about the river. So I took this chunk of it, see where the yellow line is there, that's the 6 kilometre, that's the rowing reach. So you have where the red dot is, that's the boathouse there. And this is really the extent of the river that the rowers use. So it made sense to me to take that chunk to really kind of look at in depth and working with communities along that route. And it's just like packed full of stories, and it runs right through the East End, which is a part of the city that really doesn't get a lot of attention really from the heritage sector. So sporting heritage did form a big part of the project, but it was really about the river. So one of the things that became very important, I think partly because of COVID actually, was kind of trying to address the kind of dysfunctional relationship that Glaswegians tend to have with the river. It's still seen as kind of dead and dirty and dangerous, and actually it's a river in recovery. It's bouncing back from 150 years of industrial abuse and pollution, and while there is still a lot of problems, there are actually, we have over 30 species of fish living in the river. I've seen seals and herons and cormorants and an otter right up at the West Boathouse, right in the middle of the city centre. Last year was the 40th anniversary of the first salmon run in the Clyde in over 120 years, and that kind of idea of a recovering river became something that people really responded to. I think, again, particularly over COVID, we adapted a lot of our kind of engagement and activities to kind of outdoor kind of stuff, and people rediscovering that stretch of the river, and having a kind of like thinking about it differently, I think, and understanding that that there is life in the river, and that you can come back from, you can recover from that kind of legacy of industry. It was a kind of hopeful message rather than that kind of nostalgic kind of looking backwards towards, oh, well, we've lost this and we've lost that. And I'm not saying that shipbuilding wasn't important, but it's not the only game in town when it comes to the kind of heritage of the river. There's lots of other stories there too. And certainly heavy industry has done a lot of damage to the environment and to the people that worked in these industries. And I think maybe just kind of rethinking that a little bit. Yeah, people really responded to it. So we took a very much kind of holistic approach and blended that kind of natural and cultural heritage and the tangible and the intangible together. So I was just going to run through some of the activities that we did. So there was lots of kind of citizen science stuff, and raising awareness around about wildlife and the environmental history of the Clyde. We did a project with the Clyde River Foundation called Mon the Fish. So we had 4 primary schools who got tanks of baby trout in with them for 6 weeks. So they fed them and they learned about their life cycles and kept them alive. And then we did a kind of fish release. We also did lots of kind of citizen science, so biodiversity monitoring. We did outdoor learning CPD with conservation volunteers. We did boat building, built 2 skiffs with Glasgow Disability Alliance. So those are now with the Glasgow Humane Society. So they're using them for rescue work and for litter picks and whatnot. We made a film with Riverbank Primary School in Dalmarnock using archive footage from the 1960s as a kind of a springboard really for conversations around about kind of what it takes to make a community. On the sporting heritage side, we did a joint project with Glasgow Caledonian University, a Wikipedia editing project that kind of was really aimed at increasing the number of women's bios or sporting heritage bios on Wikipedia, training up new editors, and yeah, just trying to put a little bit of a dent in those kind of narratives around about gender and sport. And another one of my volunteers, Tam McCann, he started working on project mapping heritage sites, or well, actually modern ones as well, but any sort of historic and modern places associated with sport across Glasgow. He's now just over 1,000 sites mapped out there, and we're hoping that we'll be taking that a bit further with a joint project with Glasgow Cali Uni and Glasgow Uni. And then we had the club's heritage collections as well. So we catalogued and digitised everything that came out of the boathouse. It was all decanted up to our offices, and had the archaeology students actually from Glasgow Uni came in and did a huge amount of work on that. So this was some of the material that that Clydesdale had in their collections. So obviously both clubs. So Clydesdale was founded in 1856 and Clyde in 1865. So, I mean, they had minute books and tons of old photos, bits of oars and all kinds of stuff going back to the 1850s. I think this was the earliest photo we had which is taken in Glasgow, but it's actually of the Royal Chester Amateur Rowing Club from 1862. That's them working through some of the collections there. And then we had a nice big opening party last year. So yeah, it was a really lovely project to work on. So I thought I'd just maybe kickstart a little discussion for when I stop talking. But one of the things that we get asked a lot is why do these projects take so long and why do they cost so much? So as I said earlier, every building is unique. All our projects are kind of hand knitted. So all the projects are unique, the surrounding communities are unique, and that eventual end user will have unique needs. That renovation or restoration process is really complex, and there's lots of different factors that contribute to those timescales and the high costs. And the first stage is always kind of explore how a building could be reused, who it would be reused by, and what kind of construction work needs to be undertaken to make that happen. So that'll include community consultation, discussions with funders, technical surveys, historical research, design work, business planning, and extensive negotiations with conservation and planning authorities. So that's Historic Environment Scotland and the local authority. We also have a lot of discussions with building owners and other key stakeholders. And retrofitting also requires that old buildings are improved to meet current expectations in terms of accessibility and environmental sustainability. So all those factors impact on timescales and costs. And it's a big chunk of the work that I do is kind of trying to manage people's expectations, because understandably they get frustrated at the time that it takes. But those kind of early planning stages are really, really critical to ensuring that long-term viability and success. So once the construction works are underway, you might also hit some additional surprises. You might find, I mean, if any of you live in an old building, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's all kinds of things will be hidden away that you miss maybe in technical surveys. They can have hidden structural issues, or that you might uncover, architecturally significant details that would require, specialist knowledge or techniques to restore. The other thing to say is older buildings generally tend to have better quality materials and more architectural details than maybe newer constructions. And this is also something that doesn't get talked about a lot. If you're reading about a building, so architectural historians will write, oh, X building was built by whatever architect in X year, and they might give the cost for the building. What they're actually telling you is the material costs. They very rarely factor in the labour costs, and those were very low in the past. So even your highly skilled tradespeople were really kind of paid a pittance, and you've got no health and safety. It was really a very different time to be working in kind of construction, and the city's wealth was really kind of concentrated in the pockets of a very small minority, mostly kind of merchants and businessmen, and they like to express their civic pride and advertise their importance through architecture. So as a result of that, we have inherited a legacy of very grand civic, commercial and religious buildings, which are very expensive to maintain. And if you were trying to replicate the quality and the detail of a historic building in today's market, it would cost significantly more than at the time of their construction. That also has an impact on repair and restoration work, because you're often required to provide, that kind of high quality like for like replacement of damaged elements, and that all costs money. The technical skills and the material costs are much higher, and it takes longer to complete the work. And there's other factors too. So, you can plan as much as you like and it will mitigate against costs and timescales, but there are other external factors that can have an impact, and they're really difficult to predict. So material costs, supply chains, and labour shortages due to Brexit, to COVID, and the war in the Ukraine have had a huge impact on the construction sector. We've lost an awful lot of skilled craft people and construction workers over the last sort of 5 years. And getting hold of contractors has become A, much more difficult, and B, much more expensive. So overall, it's really hard to get a handle on how much costs have gone up, but they're mostly estimating somewhere between 30 and 40% just in the past 5 years. We also, that skills shortage, Historic Environment Scotland released a paper a couple of weeks ago, the Skills Investment Plan. So they're estimating that we need another 10,000 skilled trades workers to meet the need within our historic built environment. And we also have lots of issues with delinquent landlords sitting on properties that they think are going to make them an awful lot of money, and they're not. So they sit on them, and yeah, they just slowly go to seed. So if you've been paying attention to the news or the local news recently, you've probably seen the photos of the Eagle buildings down on Bridge Street coming down. That's a classic case. So somebody sitting on that building for years and just letting it go. I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see Glasgow City Council making moves towards compulsory purchase orders, which they used to do a lot of. Obviously, in the 60s and 70s, there were tens of thousands of compulsory purchase orders. But from about the 1980s onwards, that kind of skill set, so all the kind of legal side of it, because they are very, very expensive and very difficult to undertake, that skill set's been lost. But I think really in order to kind of tackle the scale of the problem that we have at the moment, that's going to have to come back into play. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting period. I mean, all those issues are not specific to Glasgow. I guess Glasgow, one of the things I wanted to pull out here, so this map here is the couple of snapshots from the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So it's a blunt instrument, but at the scale we're looking at here, it does tell a story. And it's really about the geographic distribution of wealth in 4 of our major cities here. So we've got Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen. Red areas are the areas with the highest areas of deprivation, and the dark blues here, so you can see Edinburgh's doing quite nicely for itself. Thing that I wanted to point out here is actually looking at the local authority boundaries. So you can see with Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and to an extent Dundee, the city is contained within the local authority boundary area. So all that revenue from council tax comes in and goes into that central pot. If you look at Glasgow, it's a very different story. So places like Bishopbriggs, Mulgai, Bearsden, Giffnock, Newton Mearns, yeah, very blue. And none of that revenue is coming into the city centre. So the suburbs are using our services, but not actually contributing back into that pot. And is one of the reasons why revenues for Glasgow City Council are lesser than maybe some of the other local authorities. And I realise that GCC is kind of everybody's favourite punching bag, but they are really trying. And we're also seeing, funding shortfalls on all fronts. So a kind of local authority and national level. So it's a difficult situation at the moment. There's no way really to kind of sugarcoat it. However, I think there are some reasons to be cheerful. And there's kind of pundits are kind of 10 a penny. There's lots of people commenting on the state of Glasgow buildings at the moment, and And the politics around about that are really interminable. And there's a certain amount of kind of recreational complaining as well. Just it just becomes a bit of a pile-on, and I understand people get frustrated, but there's no kind of easy solutions here. There's no fix-all kind of panacea. What I would say is there are really good people working within the sector. They're really tenacious and they really care. And I do worry a little bit when the city council are getting a kicking all the time, that we risk pushing some of those people out because they get so much abuse. You know, it's a bit like the National Health Service. It brings people down after a while, and it's something to kind of bear in mind when you are getting frustrated about the state of the city. So on the positive side, I think there's a much wider appreciation of and an appetite for heritage than maybe ever before. I think particularly amongst the kind of younger cohort, there's a lot of concern about climate change, and they're much more kind of tuned into the idea of reusing and recycling than maybe previous generations. I think if GCC can get a handle on compulsory purchase orders, then that's going to be a bit of a game changer. So the building that you can see here, that's the old St James School in the Calton. That's currently undergoing a big restoration. That will be the new Gaelic Medium School for the east end of the city. We've just finished a wee project with them. There's also a ton of other projects on the go at the moment. So not GBPT stuff, but we have had an involvement in. So Collock Stables is now on site. The Brigade should be completing next year. The pipe factory in the Calton has just been successful in getting funding for a full renovation there. There's a lot happening on Sauchiehall Street, and there's also the Avenues project. I know some of that is causing a bit of a stushy because it's closing roads and stuff, but it's seeing that longer term gains is the kind of key there. You've got to keep your eyes on the prize. It's momentary inconvenience. I hope that in the long term it'll be worth it. From our own side, we've just finished a big heritage asset study for Glasgow City Council. We've also just been working on the St James School. We've just finished up Govan Hill Baths, the first phase of that. So the building is now, and that's a massive project. It's an entire city block. There's still a lot of fundraising to be done there, but at least the building is safe, and it's wind and watertight. So the envelope's completed. We've also been fundraising for Carntyne Parish Church, and we've got a ton of feasibility studies on the go at the moment. So Pollokshaws Borough Halls, Panopticon, Queen's Park Glasshouse, etc., etc. I guess the other thing that might come to the fore over the next couple of years is the VAT issue. I think there have been some calls now to reconsider VAT on repairs and maintenance because of that disincentive to reuse and keep your buildings maintained. I don't think that's going to happen overnight, and it would have serious implications for us because it's a big part of our funding stream because we can claim that back. But again, thinking about the bigger picture, if we are serious about repurposing and reusing historic buildings and not sending them to landfill, then that is something that we need to seriously consider. So our next big project, fingers crossed, will be Whiteville Baths in the Gallowgate. So that was built in 1902. The ponds, the swimming ponds and the steamy have all been demolished, but this building here, the front office block, is in reasonable condition. It's wind and watertight. And we've done a feasibility study, and we have a fantastic end user lined up. We just need to find £8.5 million to get that off the ground. That's for quite a light touch refurbishment and a small extension on the rear. So that gives you some idea of how much those costs have escalated over the last wee while. And we're hoping that these guys will be our end user. So that's Peak Projects, who are a kids charity based in the East End. They've been running for over 20 years and they've never had a permanent home of their own. They've moved premises, I think, 17 times over that period, including 4 times over COVID, and somehow still managed to continue delivering all their play programs and distributing food and clothes, and they're just fantastic. They're such a great charity, and it's that kind of thing that really makes it worthwhile, knowing that you're giving a bit of kind of stability and a kind of forever home for an organisation that is going to do so much good for that community, and in a community that really needs it. And it's one of the few kind of remaining historic buildings in the area. So really excited to get started on that. So I think that's probably it from me.